Do you ever try to train glutes and hamstrings and all you can ever feel is your back, specifically on an exercise like this, like an RDL or a deadlift? Well, if you do, this is the video for you. I'm going to talk to you about how you can troubleshoot this problem, if it's a problem for you, in a variety of different ways. So the first thing to recognize about this situation is that feeling your back is completely normal. Now, feeling your back in a sort of bad way, which many of you can easily differentiate from like the good kind of tension, is obviously a different conversation, right? We leave that pain conversation elsewhere. What we're talking about really is like feeling more stuff in the back versus the hips. The first sort of change that you can make, number one, is creating a clear reference point against which you can stop the motion. So what does that mean? Well, imagine that you are doing an RDL type motion like this. And let's say that when you get to this point in the range, your hips are at this angle, knees are at this angle, and your spine can stay relatively neutral, all right, whatever that means to you. But to get below this point, let's say to bring, the imaginary barbell maybe down to this point, maybe let's say you've actually run out of hip range of motion. And so instead of now continuing to sort of bend through this point here, what you do in essence is you just kind of round over that way, right? To continue to move lower. So what happens is the load may move from here to here, but what got you from here to here, right? What actually changed in terms of the positioning for you to move from A to B? Well, all you did was you just rounded your back. And if all you do is round your back, then all you're going to load are tissues that function to prevent your back from rounding, i.e. your erector muscles, right? So if that's your goal, great. However, if your goals are to train your hips, you basically just want to lower to a point where all that's really doing the moving is your hips, at least predominantly, right? There's only so much spine motion that we can avoid, and in some instances, we should intentionally try to create it. But in this particular case, we want to basically create a stopping point that is very clear, and specifically that occurs at a point where we're about to start to round here, but where we don't. So this could literally be you placing a box here in front of you to touch the weight to, right? Not like to slam the weight down into, but just to literally see as a visual reference point, okay, here, I'm just tapping the weight to that point every single time that I go down and I go up. Another strategy that you could use is, instead of having to use like an external landmark, basically create your own landmark somewhere along your, knee, or maybe slightly below your knee. Some of you, based on how you're organizing this, may actually stop above your knee, and that's okay. The big picture takeaway here is that you shouldn't be just creating an arbitrary point, number one, or not paying attention to where you're going down to at all, number two. Where you need to get to will be individual to you. So what I would recommend, practically speaking, is filming yourself from a side angle from this perspective with your phone or whatever is convenient. Have a friend do it if you don't have a tripod or whatever, or you can't set it up somewhere, and just go through the hinge and watch how much motion is occurring through this segment versus how much is just occurring through this thing bending, okay? Because the difference between this moving a lot and this moving a little is probably the difference between you mostly feeling this stuff and feeling more of this stuff back here. Now, from a curing perspective, and I'll move on to numbers 2 and 3 in just a second, what can be beneficial in terms of actually finding that stop point? If you imagine these are your hips right here, what you basically want to think about occurring at the bottom is you want to think about this bony prominence approximating or touching somewhere on the front of this, right? Obviously, they're not going to touch because there's a lot of other stuff involved here. But basically what will happen, and including all the muscular bulk, is this bony prominence will come down and touch the muscular bulk. And that's kind of what your reference point should be for a stopping point. So as you lower down, your goal isn't just to go as low as possible. Your goal is basically to find this point called the anterior superior iliac spine, and you're basically finding that point when it touches your thigh. And so a really simple thing that you can do to assess this and test this is take your fingers and basically put your thumbs on that bony prominence. You'll feel it's basically like, if here's my belly button, I'm going to go to the side, I'm going to go down, you'll feel these big bony prominences. And then take your index fingers and put them on the tops of your thighs. And when you do this, you'll have kind of like L-shaped or like, finger gun shaped things going on. Thumbs again here on that bony prominence that I mentioned, fingers here, and then when you go down, all you're doing is just bringing those 2 points closer together. And when you bring those points closer together, you'll feel your hamstring stretch out, you feel your glutes stretch out, and your back not so coincidentally, will not be just the thing that is actively rounding. Why? Because you're paying attention to the angle change between the hips and the actual thighs. So what you're doing is you're basically bringing those 2 points closer apart, right? So you're closing the fingers, and then on the way up, you're opening the fingers. Close the fingers, open the fingers. And once the fingers are closed, that's it. We're not going lower than we need to, again, for the goal of training the hips in this context. Okay, so all that being said, points number 2 and number 3 are gonna relate to altering the exercise selection. Because keep in mind that we don't have to stay within the arbitrarily defined constraints of a single exercise if for whatever reason it's not working for our intended goal. So the first thing that you could do, and potentially easiest thing you could do, is just swap, at least temporarily, from barbells to something like or more similar to dumbbells. And so with dumbbells, what you can do is move the dumbbell closer to or farther away from you. And, you know, obviously you can move a barbell farther away from you, but you can't move a barbell beyond the point of the shin, right? You can't hold the barbell over top of, or rather through one of these segments for obvious reasons. But with dumbbells, what you can do is you can actually shift yourself backward in this direction. And so in essence, what ends up happening is your hips will move somewhere more like this. Your upper body will move more like this. And the dumbbells can fall kind of more like this. And so if you erase the other diagram and now we just have this one, the load is actually ending up in a position where relative to the first diagram, it ends up being closer to the lower back. In other words, when you move the dumbbells a little bit more on top of your knee, and maybe, you know, you allow your knees to bend a little bit more, right? You maybe change the bias in terms of the hip dominance, right? From more of a hamstring thing to maybe a little bit more of a glute thing because your knees are bending, right? But in essence, you're doing something at least somewhat similar with the load in a position that's more comfortable for you. So the sort of most practical takeaway from this adjustment is try changing the implement. This could be going from a barbell to dumbbells. This could be going from dumbbells to a trap bar. This could be from going to any of those things to some kind of specialty bar or some kind of cable, maybe where the cable is pulling directly down underneath of you as opposed to, you know, slightly forward or away from you, like the original barbell variation that we showed. So in essence, number 2 and tip number 2 is just to change the implement. Now, tip number 3 is going to be a change of implement, but more specifically in relationship to machines. So why machines? Well, certain machines are guided. And what I mean by guided is that they are constrained to moving in a particular way wherein they will assist your ability to feel your glutes and your hamstrings and your adductors without a lot of this back stuff going on. So the clearest example in my estimation is when you're in something like a Smith machine, right? So a Smith machine basically has a line of force, at least a lot of them, that is slightly angled like this. And what this in essence means is that we can position ourselves with our head basically facing in this direction. And because the bar path is actually oriented backward, if you think about like this being a sort of 0 point over here, this would be directly up and down. As you start to move your hips back, and this is basically a variation where your knees would be straight, like kind of an extreme like hamstring dominant thing. As you move your hips in this direction, what's actually happening is the path and the constraint of the machine is encouraging you to move in that direction. And what this will do is it will really allow you to just translate your hips forward and backward in this direction, as opposed to straightening and bending your spine against the load, right? Because in this particular case, it would be very awkward to just start randomly bending and straightening your spine against the load if your hips are moving in exactly the same path and sort of efficiently in the same path as this bar path that's directed that way. And so this is an example of using a machine and making use of the Smith machine specifically and facing in that direction to where you can actually orient your hips backward in such a way where the vast majority of the stimulus will fall just basically to the glutes and to the hamstrings as opposed to the erectors, unlike a free weight RDL of any kind. So the use of sort of guided machine-based paths is very, very unique because it doesn't force us to constrain ourselves to having to balance over our feet. And when we have to balance over our feet, the erectors and the spinal muscles need to get a lot more involved as compared to when we have guidance like this. In addition, if any of you have seen something similar to this, like a V-squat machine where you basically have like a pad and that pad basically goes sort of forward and down like this where people can face, inward in this direction. Very similar concept where when the pad goes down, the pad is actually traveling backward. In other words, a very shorthand rule of thumb for these is like, if you pay attention to this direction of a path, or like, again, this pad sort of arcing downward in that direction, both of these are encouraging our hips to move in the direction of the implement. And again, that can create a lot easier of an execution process for these motions and to make them hip dominant rather than spine dominant. So in essence, if you're, in a gym that doesn't have machines or a bunch of different options, use the first strategy, use those reference points, whether it's on your body or not on your body, and make sure that you're understanding that whole cueing process of where your hip range of motion actually ends versus where your spine motion starts. But then if you do have all these options, I highly, highly recommend just seeing what happens if you change the implement from, again, something like a barbell to a dumbbell or a trap bar, or from any of those things to something machine-based where you have an ability to actually take advantage of that guidance to where you can decrease the erector activity and increase the proportion of hip involvement.